I'm going to be talking to Max Fawcett, the national columnist for the National Observer, and we're going to be talking about the Alberta Canada pipeline MOU that was signed yesterday. There's all sorts of wrinkles to it. This is a major political event, folks. So this is not just for Alberta and BC. Has national implications. It says a lot about Prime Minister Mark Carney and how he plans to handle the pivot away from Trump and the United States. So I'm going to enjoy looking forward to this conversation. Welcome to the interview, Max.
No, thank you for having me.
Well, you wrote a column yesterday, The Method to Mark Carney's Madness. And why don't you lay out the argument for the folks?
Sure. I have been trying for some time to sort of divine what he's trying to accomplish with his grand bargain with Alberta. I start from a couple of assumptions. I start from the assumption that he understands energy markets. He understands the things that you and I think, agree on around, broadly where the global energy transition is headed and oil demand and things like that. And I also assume that he still cares about climate policy. It has been a driving force, a driving concern throughout his career. When he was governor of the Bank of Canada, governor of the Bank of England, in places where he didn't really have to care about climate policy, and he really did. So I don't think he's abandoned that just because he likes being prime minister. And so those were the lenses that I applied to the announcement on Thursday. I was at the TELUS Convention Center in Calgary, where they had the event. Full house. He got two standing ovations, which does not happen in Calgary for Liberal prime ministers. That the room was basically in love with him. The chatter was just incredibly positive, and I don't think he's sold out to Danielle Smith and her vision of the future. I think he understands that he has something of value to dangle in front of her, and that he can get things of value in return. His priority is not to protect the climate infrastructure that Justin Trudeau has built, in large part because a lot of that infrastructure is falling apart because the Trudeau government failed to defend it. His priority is very singular: carbon pricing. It will be industrial carbon pricing that drives the carbon competitiveness agenda, that drives investments in Canada, and that is the lens that he sees things through. And in this deal, if you look at the terms, he gets quite a few things that advance that cause. You get Alberta committing to a carbon price of $130 per ton. Right now in Alberta, in the carbon market, because of various shenanigans that Alberta has been up to, I think credits are trading at $25 to $30 a ton. So closing that gap is essential. He gets Alberta to agree to an expanded intertie with BC, which is super important for addition of more wind and solar in Alberta, more electrification. And he gets an agreement around just sort of the broader trajectory of carbon pricing, of industrial carbon pricing, that they are going to stop ragging the puck. Now, I know there's a lot of devil in those details. I agree. I think if things do not get ironed out in a way that include carbon contracts for difference, other financially binding mechanisms with Alberta, then this isn't going to work. But he gets all of his things much sooner than Danielle Smith gets her things. And as you and I both know, as I've written many times, the biggest impediment to building that pipeline in the North Coast, it's not David Eby, it's not even coastal First Nations, it's the economics. They simply will not get enough shippers pledging enough barrels to be able to build that pipeline. And I think Mark Carney knows that. And so him promising to support Danielle Smith's endeavors when he knows those endeavors are probably doomed to fail is not a very big give on his part. And he does seem to be getting some things of value here.
I wrote a Substack post this morning that laid out three scenarios here. And I'll just run through them very quickly and get you to respond to them. So the first one is cue the parade on 4th Avenue. Wahoo! Alberta got what it wants, pedal to the metal. Let's go. Mark Carney's a god. Number two, Mark Carney is very, kind of your argument, very strategic. He gave, but he got a lot. And he really put the onus on Smith. And then the third is the one that we adhere to, which is that this is basically the wrong strategic vision in the first place. It should have been, bitumen into advanced materials. It should have been advanced geothermal. It should have been electrification, a lot of other things. That should have been the thrust. Okay, so there's three. But Dwayne Bratt, and I gather you were on debating Dwayne on CBC this morning, but Dwayne did an interview with me just a little while ago, and he said, look, Mark Carney has opened the door for Alberta, Smith, and the oil industry. Now we'll see if they can walk through it. If they can't, too bad. He did his best. He did what they've been asking him to do. Now the onus is on Alberta. And I think that's probably about the best we can say at this point in the game is we'll see what Alberta's up to.
Yeah, it's a bluff call. And I've been almost begging the federal government to do this for a while now, to get the Alberta government and the oil and gas industry to put their cards on the table. Deny them or deprive them of the excuse that it's always the feds and their bad laws that are getting in the way of our glorious renaissance. To sort of clear the field and say, okay, let's see what you can actually do here. And if you can't do it, you get to wear more of the blame than we have in the past. And I think I take your point about the best path being supporting electrification, supporting the development of advanced materials, building industries of the 21st century, not the 20th. There's only so much that Mark Carney can do on that front. He can't force the Alberta government to see the path of travel, especially when it's so heavily supported and informed by the status quo of the oil and gas industry. But if he can get them on a path to $130 per ton industrial carbon price, if he can get them committing to building an expanded intertie with BC, he is setting structural conditions in place for those industries of the future to better emerge. He's also, I would say, increasing the odds of the UCP losing the next election. I don't think there was a bad political outcome here for Danielle Smith. If she got the MOU, she can wave it around to people. If she didn't, she could rail against the feds. I think railing against the feds is a much more powerful weapon for her with sort of middle of the road voters. And this MOU kind of takes that off the table as an issue for her. Like, yeah, she can brag that she got a memorandum of understanding with Ottawa. I don't think that's going to hurt the NDP too much, but it just takes it off the table as an issue where she can scare voters and say, you know what, Ottawa wants to destroy our industry. They want to kill your way of life, and I'm going to defend it. That is no longer available to her. And I think that's a win for the Alberta NDP.
What do you make of veteran blogger David Klimenhaga's argument that there's going to be an election called in Alberta fairly quickly?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been hearing that for a while. I think they have to wait for the redistricting to complete, and I don't think that happens until early 2026. I see the argument. I've warned my friends in the NDP that they need to be election ready right now because this moment might be one where she tries to strike. And now, especially when you have all these recall campaigns, I think there's 14 of them now, she may decide that is a good reason to go to the polls. I'm not clear on how she views the lesson of Jim Prentice's early election call in 2015. I've heard some people say that she will not call an early election because she saw what it did to Prentice. My view is more that she understands the damage that can be done by going to the polls when oil prices are in the tank. And if she sees what everyone else is seeing in oil markets right now, which is that 2026 is going to be a bad year, she might want to get ahead of that before WTI is trading at $45 and the province is staring at a $15 billion deficit. So, the NDP needs to be ready. Albertans need to be prepared for that possibility. And we'll see how it all shakes out.
I want to run something past you. You and I, like most journalists, I mean, we get people whispering in our ears all the time. They won't go on the record, but they're insiders. They're inside the oil and gas industry. They're inside the provincial government, the federal government, and you get a view of the dynamics inside those organizations. And of course, I've been getting some of that particularly lately. And what people are saying, and it jives with what I'm seeing on the outside, is that the oil and gas industry and the Alberta government for sure, but even the oil and gas industry, where all those, as you call them, spreadsheet jockeys, are playing with numbers, really believes in the OPEC vision of the oil future, that in fact we're going to see significant growth in oil demand out to 2050, about 17 million barrels a day, driven by emerging economies and people moving up to middle class, wanting cars, wanting stuff that needs to be made out of plastic and petrochemicals. And that they just this is the narrative. They've bought the narrative. Smith has bought the narrative inside Tim Hodgson, the Minister of Energy, inside Enercan, they bought the vision, and it's like lemmings just heading to the cliff. That's what I'm hearing. It's kind of jibes with what I'm seeing. What's your take on that argument?
I don't know if you can turn over Enercan that quickly to get that sort of a shift in mindset. I think people who are in and around the regulation of the oil industry, the operation of it, are always going to be kind of structurally coded as optimists, and for them, optimist is more growth. I just kind of think that's just the way the incentive structures line up. But I would just be very nervous about that. The upside for Alberta, for Canada, if the OPEC vision comes to fruition, is it's there. We sell more stuff, we generate more revenue. That's great. But the risk reward is clearly skewed in the other direction. If the stated policies, the IEA stated policy scenario comes true, or something even more aggressive than that, based on what's happening in developing markets in China and India and Pakistan with electrification, our downside is enormous, potentially. And if we are even contemplating building more pipelines in that environment, we are signing ourselves up for just sunk costs and stranded assets as far as the eye can see. And I think, if this was 2015, if this was 2012, I would understand the bullish mindset a little more, because you really hadn't seen any evidence that the demand tanker was going to turn around, so to speak. But we know it's turning. The only question is, when is it going to turn, and how fast is it going to turn? And in that moment, you don't want to be late on the energy transition. You would probably be better advised to be early. That would be the more prudent play. And so if there is that kind of mindset in NRCan, that is bad, and that is worrying, because it's not going to set us up well for what is going to come. I mean, look, this is the thing with a new pipeline, is let's say we build Northern Gateway 2.0. It happens somehow, and it's empty, or it's mostly empty because demand starts to roll over. Well, that raises everyone's costs, because pipeline shipping costs go up because you're spreading the cost of the pipeline across fewer barrels in it. It deteriorates everyone's economics. Like, everything starts to fall apart pretty fast in that situation. And at the very least, we need to start doing some scenario planning, by the government. It should be Alberta, but I think it would have to be Ottawa. What does a disorderly transition look like, right? What is the potential downside here? Because we're just kind of approaching this, it feels like sometimes, only with the upside in mind. And if you invested your own money like that, you would not be in a good spot.
Max, I don't know how many times you've heard me say this, but in Alberta, where mom says, hope for the best, plan for the worst, Alberta plans for the best and says, what worst?
Yeah.
And that's often the case. And I worry, because my sources in Ottawa tell me that it's not the career bureaucrats in NRCan that are the issue. I didn't coin this. One of my sources said this to me, said the Carney bros have been installed in NRCan. They're setting the agenda, and everybody else just, okay, we back off. And you see that in Calgary all the time, where the folks who oppose their employer's agenda, oppose the government, but they're employed. I mean, that's how they pay their mortgage, put food on the table. So they just keep quiet. And I worry that the Carney bros are out of control, and they've linked up with the oil bros in Alberta and the Smith government, and it's an unholy alliance.
I mean, it could be. I think the Carney bros are a lot more sophisticated and a lot more distant from the kind of mindset in Alberta that doesn't really seem to do a good job of incorporating other perspectives on this issue. I think Bay Street, there's certainly like groupthink on Bay Street around this stuff. And it is, like a diluted version maybe of what happens in Calgary. But, the challenge here is that all of the costs of a disorderly transition would mostly be borne by other people, right? It would be future versions of ourselves. It would be, if you're an executive at a corporation, it would be someone else because you'd be retired by then. If you're in Mark Carney's office or if you're in Tim Hodgson's office, it's some other politician. Who knows if it'll even be a liberal? And so there's just not a big incentive or the incentive structure is not oriented correctly to have people think about this thoughtfully. It's much easier and more sort of gratifying emotionally to be able to go into these rooms and places and say, yeah, let's build, let's do everything. Everything's going to turn out really well. Than to go in there and say, hey, we need to pump the brakes and be a little more cautious here. Especially when you have, 10 years of a federal government that was pretty cautious and didn't do a very good job of explaining why at all times. It often felt like it was the sort of, Laurentian consensus being imposed on Alberta. I don't think you can accuse Mark Carney of that. But they are having to dig out from under a lot of political debris that was left behind by the Trudeau people, especially on this file.
Yeah, it felt like for many years it was Max Fawcett and a few others who kept telling the Trudeau government's narrative because the Trudeau government wouldn't do it itself.
Yeah, I mean that is sadly true. I feel like I wasn't trying to do their work for them. I was just trying to help surface the arguments that defended what I thought were pretty good policies. In a different universe, those policies might still be in place, and I don't think we would be too troubled by them. But one of the cardinal mistakes that the Trudeau people made was they would win an election and then assume that everything that had been talked about in that election was settled. Right? Carbon tax settled, TMX settled, and they would just leave it alone. And the Conservatives would go back and start doing rearguard actions and digging up what they had laid down, and all of a sudden you've lost the war you thought you won. So,
hey, I want to bring up a point that it's kind of arcane. I admit that, but it's really, really important. And with respect to what the federal government's role could be in approving a pipeline and pushing over the objections of the BC government and the First Nations. And that is something that Mark Carney said, I think it was a Wednesday or Tuesday during question period in the House. And he said, we're going to rely on cooperative federalism. Now, that actually is a constitutional principle where basically you have conflicting provincial and federal laws. And the courts have said, province, Ottawa, you must cooperate here. And when the BC government took the federal government to court over Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline, it used the cooperative federalism argument. It said, look, we have laws that apply here. The federal government, we should work together to make this where you shouldn't impose the federal view. And that is not the decision that, or not the direction the courts went. The courts upheld the National Energy Board, which said, paramountcy applies. That means the federal government cannot be frustrated by the provincial government. And I thought it was so interesting that Carney would use that term in the House, and because it's a big signal to BC that, hey, we're not going to maybe bulldoze you. We were going to rely on your cooperation, and if we don't get it, maybe that calls into question the viability of the project.
Yeah, as I said in my call, I think Carney is sending a lot of signals to, Premier David Eby, to climate folks in BC that, it's kind of like when he was with Trump and he referred to him as a transformational president. And Trump thought that was just delightful. And everyone who was watching could see Carney kind of winking at them going, this guy is fucking nuts. And I feel like that's kind of what he's saying here to, non-oil and gas Albertans, which is like, look, we're going to let these crazy bastards take a swing at it because they really feel like they need to. But at the end of the day, I'm not going to jam this down your throats because it's just not the way I want to do business. And I think British, I understand the concerns that have been brought forward. Folks in BC have pointed out that, this kind of puts Indigenous coastal First Nations in the line of fire where they have to relitigate something and re-articulate a position that they had made very clear over and over again during Northern Gateway. And it puts them in a spot where they are probably going to be subject to vitriol, to harassment, whatever have you, if they are seen as obstructing Alberta's ambitions. And I would hope that the federal government does not allow that to happen, that it does not allow this to devolve into Alberta versus coastal First Nations, because that's an ugly dynamic. Um, I think it's more that Carney understands that, you know, uh, the private sector, in the fullness of their reluctance and caution, will kill this themselves. They will not have um, they will not be able to summon the collective courage to say we're going to pledge 1 million barrels of new production, and we're going to sanction, all these new oil sands projects that we have that will cost $70 to $80 per barrel break even. They just won't. I don't think they can do that in this price environment, in the environment they have, where their shareholder base, and this gets really sort of wonkish, but the shareholder base of oil and gas companies over the last decade has been transformed from one that really wanted to see growth. It was really important for them to grow, to one that is just relentlessly focused on, are you giving us as much money as possible back? Dividends, buybacks. They do not want to see oil and gas companies take big swings. And whenever an oil and gas company does that, if they buy another company, if they announce a big project, their shares get punished, because their shareholder base now wants their income, they want their returns, they want their dividends, and so forth. And I just don't think those companies are going to be able to get those shareholders to suddenly agree to massive new oil sands projects.
And I think that argument applies to not only the oil sands producers, but also to pipeline companies. But here's the fly in the ointment. I think that those companies still kind of subscribe to the OPEC view of the future, and there may be some opportunity, but they understand that there are risks. They can feel them if they don't understand them. And here's my prediction, Max. We'll see if this comes true. I think in next June, July, whenever there has to be a pipeline proposal submitted to the government for designation as a project of national interest, then referred to the Major Projects Office. I think Alberta, as a Crown corporation, will be the proponent, and it will have some minor members, like maybe one or two or three pipeline companies. And the point here is the industry will say, okay, we're willing to take a swing, but we're not swinging for the fences. This is singles and doubles time here, not triples and homers. And we're government, particularly Alberta, we want you to de-risk us, So that's both on the pipeline side and on the oil sands supply side and on the carbon capture and storage side. And so I think that government will be asked to de-risk. Alberta will step up and say yes. The feds will say, hey, we're already doing a lot on carbon capture and storage. That's it. We're not going to participate in this pipeline. That puts us in an awkward position. And then we'll see where the chips fall.
It's possible. They could also do that through expanding the bitumen royalty in kind program, and then pledging those additional barrels to a pipeline. So essentially, filling the pipe themselves. I think that gets a little murky. But the feds, the Carney people should be ready for this, and they should be ready to have an answer to that. If having a private sector proponent is one of their conditions. If it is, then having a Crown corporation do it, sorry, that's not going to happen. We need to see a private sector company doing it. Now, can Alberta gin it up so it looks like a private sector company is a proponent? Maybe, I guess. I just think these companies have bigger fish to fry. Like, they have other projects on their docket that don't have all the political risk, don't have all the uncertainty. They know they can make money on, and I think they're just going to focus. Why don't we just keep building out this other stuff that we have, rather than focusing on this white elephant that the premier wants to build. If I was Ottawa, one way of sort of hedging the risk here would be try to get the expansion of TMX going and get barrels pledged to that. Because if you get barrels pledged to that first, they can't be pledged to any other pipeline. And then you're effectively soaking up all the additional production that's predicted for the system. And the province will they won't have anything to put in their white elephant.
And let us not forget that Enbridge, only just a couple of weeks ago, committed to spending billions on upgrading its main line by 400,000 barrels a day.
Yep.
So, that would effectively, because they're going to put it out for What's the term, Max, when they ask for commitments? Uh,
Oh, I want to say open season, but that's
It is
not it.
open season. It is
Is
open
it?
season. They declare an open season for the expanded part of the pipeline. 400,000 barrels a day is a lot of expansion. That the forecast increase in oil sands supply between now and 2030 is only 500,000 barrels a day, and that's seen as a major expansion. So you
Yeah.
add that much more onto that pipeline, and then you go and add another 300 to 400,000 barrels a day on the TMX, which is what was in the MOU, not the 200,000 to 300,000. And all of a sudden now you've got a lot more shipping capacity that you've got to fill up.
Exactly. And that was always my argument about, the lack of a business case for this pipeline is that if you add up all of that easy incremental capacity, it soaks up more than 100% of projected growth to 2035. And after 2035, I'm not sure you want to be an oil company ramping up production. Like maybe, I don't know. The future is notoriously hard to predict, but my money would be on things turning by then. And if things turn, you're going to see the price drop. You're going to see, every producer basically trying to get what they can out. And that's not an environment where you're going to sanction a new oil sands project that takes 15 years to pay you back. It's just not going to happen. So I think we're good, right? I think that's always been my perspective is we have enough to grow, to meet the growth, the industry will be fine. They'll be cranking it up. You're never going to see the kind of employment boom that you saw in the mid 2000s because that's just not happening anywhere in the world, no matter what the price is. And all of this fails to account for the fact that, again, oil could be $40 a barrel next year. It could be $45 a barrel in 2027. Nobody is growing their production growth or their production in that sort of an environment. It just, shareholders are going to be, they will murder management teams that try to grow their production in that sort of an environment. And so the industry and Daniel Smith, they're running out of clock, right? They don't have a lot of clock yet left to get the football in the end zone.
I would argue that they do. They think they do, and I think there's plenty of evidence for the fact that they're not plugged into what's going on globally. But anyway, that's not the point I wanted to make, and I'm kind of wrap up our interview. But we've been arguing for months now that the far more rational strategy here is to optimize every bit of infrastructure you've already got. Don't build new, optimize. So you got the TMX, we've already talked about that. We've talked about Enbridge, so there's roughly 700 to 800,000 barrels a day. There's another 250,000 barrels a day in pipelines going south that could be added through optimization. Now you're up over probably a million. And as we will continue to argue, there is a big opportunity for Alberta to step up and say, we're going to build an advanced materials industry that uses bitumen domestically. We're going to do asphalt binder, which we will process domestically, and so all a combination of optimization plus building new industries that will really pay off like 2035, 2040. That is a rational strategy, and I think that is our basic argument here is that the rational strategy is the far better approach than this political, dog's breakfast that we're dealing with.
No argument at all. And I, in the room yesterday, hearing the way Mark Carney talked about renewables, talked about materials, talked about things other than pipelines, you could tell that's where his head is at. Like he understands that that's where the game is, but he can't push too hard on that lever without Alberta, reacting like a petulant child. And I think that's the frustration. Look, if I'm the Alberta NDP, I take what you just said, copy paste, and that's my energy policy is, we optimize what we have, what we can for as long as this combustion demand is there, but we prepare for the future we all know is coming. And it's one where we can still grow our consumption of bitumen that goes to other things, that goes to materials, goes to asphalt, like you said, higher end purposes that are going to grow, not decline, and are probably more labor intensive than the oil and gas industry is right now. There's a lot there. Peter Lougheed, the ghost of Peter Lougheed would probably give it a rubber stamp. It's right up his alley. But and this maybe is a whole other podcast, but we don't seem to have the leadership that is able to articulate an alternative vision, right? All we have is Danielle Smith filling the room and filling the media environment with her vision, and then we get Naheed Nenshi kind of tepidly agreeing with it, right? Or tepidly disagreeing with certain aspects of it. That's not enough. The NDP needs to articulate a different vision, and it's not one that the federal NDP would like. It's not one that maybe some climate activists would be thrilled about, but it is one that can win over Albertans. They just have to do the work.
I would argue, Max, that, and again, having had enough conversations with people inside the NDP and supporters of it, is they're not prepared to do the work. And the party, even under Rachel Notley, was not culturally ready to engage with the energy industry and with the energy transition. It just prefers to stay in things in their lane, which is education and health and social issues, and that's a
Yep.
problem. And Nenshi doesn't help matters because he comes out as being, I mean, literally, his reaction yesterday was, and to every thing that Danielle Smith announces around energy is, yeah, I like that, but if it was me, if I was premier, I'd do it better than she does. So vote for
Yeah.
us. That is no energy. That's not a strategy.
No, it's like taking someone's homework and writing your own name on it and trying to pass it off as your own, right? Um,
Yep.
Look, say what you will about Danielle Smith, say what you will about the people who got her into power. They work hard, right? They do the political spade work. Some of it is highly objectionable, but they do the work. And you and I have both been kind of banging our pots and pans about this for years, saying, why isn't the NDP holding town halls and conferences and building a consensus around a different vision for energy in Alberta among people who work in the industry, among people who are in university, whatever it might be? Maybe it's just because it's too much work. I don't know. But look, no pain, no gain. And looks like the NDP is going to go into another provincial election with nothing in the cupboard on the economy or on oil and gas.
On that note, Max, interesting as always, fascinating conversation. I hate it when we violently agree at the end of it, but such is the nature of our conversations. Good to see you again, man.
Yeah, sad but true. I thought we were going to fight more, but maybe next time.